This is the last climb. Today I'll show you what happened to the couple who threw $500,000 at Everest, then refused the one cheap thing that can actually keep you alive up there. They had everything the mountain usually rewards: the guides, the money, the training, but they made a decision the world's highest peak would not allow, and what came next was so devastating that even their expedition company still refuses to talk about it. It was May 20th, 2013, just below the summit of Mount Everest, in the thin, lethal air above 26,000 feet, the place climbers call the death zone, and a husband and wife were moving slower and slower toward the top, each of them carrying no oxygen, by choice, while a guide a few steps away carried a full bottle. They had made him swear he would never make them use. Their names were Adrian and Naomi Faulkner, and they were both 34 years old, and they were, by almost any measure, an impressive couple. They had met climbing, fallen in love climbing, and built an entire shared life around the mountains and a particular idea of what mountains were for. They were strong, experienced on smaller peaks, disciplined in a way most people never manage about anything, the kind of couple who spent weekends on cold rock and evenings reading about the climbers who came before them. They had climbed serious mountains already, real ones, and they had done some of them without oxygen and lived, which is part of how they got here. Because nothing builds a dangerous belief faster than a dangerous thing you have survived a few times. Each peak they came back from alive made the philosophy feel more proven, more theirs, more like destiny instead of luck. They had climbed one of the lower giants without oxygen once before, a peak still over 26,000 feet, and come home thinner and frost-nipped, and utterly convinced, and that single success became the foundation of a confidence that Everest would eventually collect on. What they did not fully reckon with is that Everest is not just higher, it is in a different category of lethal. Its summit sitting right at the edge of what a human can survive even briefly, a place where the margin that saved them on lower peaks simply does not exist. They were not the reckless, rich tourists who turn up on Everest having never worn crampons. They had trained for years. And that is exactly what makes their story so sad, because everything that killed them came not from ignorance, but from a belief, a philosophy they had polished over a decade, that there was only one honest way to climb a mountain, and that honest way did not include the bottled oxygen that nearly every Everest climber depends on to stay alive. They were not careless with their lives. They were careful, in the service of an idea that did not deserve that much trust. They had written it all down, more or less, across years of blog posts and talks and long captions under photographs of themselves on smaller summits. The idea was always the same. Using bottled oxygen on a mountain, to them, was not climbing the mountain at all. It was lowering the mountain to meet you. And a peak climbed that way was, in their words, a peak you had not really climbed. A real summit, the only kind that counted, was one where you met the mountain on its own terms, with nothing between your lungs and the thin air but your own conditioning and will. They wrote about purity, about honesty, about the difference between visiting a summit and earning it. They wrote about how the modern Everest, with its long lines of clients sucking bottled air up a fixed rope, had become a kind of fraud, a theme park pretending to be an adventure, a place where people bought a certificate of courage they had not actually spent. And they wrote more than once, in words that read very differently now, that they would rather not summit at all than summit on a lie, that they would rather come home having failed honestly than succeeded on borrowed air. People admired it. It sounded brave and clean and certain. Almost no one pointed out that the thin air they romanced is the same thin air that kills the brain doing the romancing. I want to be fair to them, because this was not just plain stupidity, it was a belief held seriously by experienced people. But unfortunately, the mountain does not care about your philosophy. To understand what they were doing to themselves, you have to understand the death zone. Above about 26,000 feet, the air holds only a third of the oxygen your body gets at sea level, and the human body simply cannot survive there for long. It is called the death zone for the plainest possible reason, which is that everything in it is slowly dying, including you. Your body cannot acclimatize at that height, no matter how fit you are, or how many years you have trained, because there is a hard ceiling where human physiology just runs out of road. It eats itself, burns through its own reserves, shuts down digestion, starves the muscles, and most dangerously of all, starves the brain. Climbers up there describe a world gone slow and strange, every step requiring a dozen gasping breaths, simple tasks like clipping a carabiner taking minutes, the mind reduced to a dull flicker. This is why nearly every climber uses bottled oxygen up there. Not for comfort, but because the oxygen is the difference between a brain that can still make decisions and a brain that cannot. It keeps you warm enough to fight frostbite, clear enough to find the route, awake enough to keep moving and to recognize, while it still matters, the single most important moment on the whole mountain, the moment when you have to stop and go down. Take it away, and the clock starts running fast, and the mind that is supposed to save you is the first thing the mountain switches off. The body can keep walking for a while after the judgment is gone, which is exactly what makes it so deadly. A climber striding toward catastrophe with a confident smile because the part of them that should be terrified has already gone dark. Here's the thing I think most people get wrong about the no oxygen climbs. It is not really about being out of breath. It is about your brain switching off the lights while you still feel fine. Without supplemental oxygen, two specific things tend to kill people up there, and both are merciless. The first is high-altitude cerebral edema, where the oxygen-starved brain begins to swell inside the skull. It brings confusion, stumbling, slurred speech, hallucinations, and a slow, catastrophic collapse of judgment. And the cruelest part is that the victim almost never knows it is happening, because the very organ that would notice is the one drowning. People with cerebral edema have been known to sit down in the snow and announce they feel wonderful, to take off their gloves and their hats in killing cold, to wander off the route entirely, all while believing they are fine. Climbers have described holding a dying friend who was smiling and chatting pleasantly while the swelling in their brain quietly erased them. The second killer is high-altitude pulmonary edema, where fluid floods the lungs until each breath is like trying to breathe through water, until the climber is effectively drowning, standing up, coughing up froth, lips going blue. Both conditions have exactly one real treatment, which is to lose altitude immediately, to go down, and to do it while you still can. And bottled oxygen buys the time and the clarity to make that call. Adrian and Naomi had refused the oxygen, and in doing so they had refused the one thing that might have let them recognize, in time, that they needed to turn around. They had removed their own brakes and then driven toward the edge. Think with me about how cruel that is. The thing slowly killing you also switches off the part that would notice, so by the time it feels wrong to you, the part that makes choices is gone. The promise was the thing that made it unstoppable. Friends who knew them well said the two of them had made a pact years before, and renewed it more than once, that they would do the great mountains together and they would do them pure, and that neither of them would ever take oxygen even if the other begged. It was framed as devotion, as trust, as the deepest kind of partnership, two people who believed in the same thing so completely that they would hold each other to it at the very edge. They had talked about it the way other couples talk about vows, with a kind of romance, as proof of how seriously they took the thing they shared. One friend remembered Naomi saying that anyone could promise to love someone on the easy days, but that she and Adrian had promised each other something harder, to never let the other one cheat, even to save a life. At the time, it sounded like the most romantic thing in the world. What none of their friends understood then, and what is almost unbearable to think about now, is that they had essentially promised each other that if one of them started to die in the death zone, the other would honor the principle instead of saving them. They had turned their love into a rule, and the rule could only be kept by letting each other go. A viewer named Keith Maynard caught something I didn't realize about my videos. The drive that built these climbers' careers is often what destroys them. You guys watching at home give me insights I never would have reached alone, so thank you for the support. Here is the contradiction at the center of this story, the one that I cannot get past. Adrian and Naomi spent an enormous amount of money chasing this dream, somewhere near $500,000 all told, not on one climb, but across years of it. The permits, the personal guides, the private logistics, and a long string of expensive expeditions leading up to this one. A standard guided trip up Everest costs a fraction of that, but the Faulkners never did anything standard. They hired the most expensive personal guiding money could buy, the kind of one-to-one Western and Sherpa support that runs into six figures by itself, and did it again on peak after peak. They climbed a mountain where, by then, the law itself required every foreign climber to hire a local guide, where other people had fixed every rope, where the icefall doctors had risked their lives before dawn to rebuild the ladder route through the shifting ice, where a trail was already broken and marked and maintained all the way to the top. They climbed past Sherpas who had carried their gear and their tents and their fuel up the mountain ahead of them. They ate food. Someone else hauled and melted water. Someone else gathered and followed a forecast. Someone else paid a meteorologist in Europe to produce. In other words, almost nothing about their climb was actually unassisted. They were surrounded every single day by the most expensive and most generous help on Earth. The only help they refused, the one piece of support they drew a hard line against, was the cheap light thing in a guide's pack that would have kept their brains alive. They paid a fortune to call it pure, and it was never pure for 1 second. It was just missing the one part that would have brought them home. What riles me up most is that they accepted every kind of help except the one item that actually keeps you alive. They called it a pure climb, but the mountain did not care one bit what they called it. They documented all of it, of course, the way people who believe in a thing always document it, and the footage is hard to watch now. What survives came from the cameras and memory cards they had left in their tents, down at base camp and at the high camp, and recovered later from their belongings, because nothing that was still with them near the top ever came back down. There are clips of the two of them at base camp, glowing, explaining the philosophy to a camera, talking about how this was going to be the realest thing either of them had ever done. There is Adrian, somewhere on the lower mountain, breathing hard and grinning, saying that you have not lived until you have felt a mountain try to take the air out of you and refuse to give in. There is Naomi at a high camp, looking already thinner and grayer than she should, telling the lens that she has never felt more alive, that the suffering is the point, that the bottled climbers will never understand what they are missing. The people watching at home left hearts and prayers, and you are an inspiration. Nobody watching could see what a trained eye would have caught, even in those early clips, that the thing they kept calling feeling alive was the first soft edge of the thing that kills you up there, and that they were filming the early symptoms and calling them a philosophy. The people who were actually with them up there, the guides and the Sherpas, were put in an impossible position, and some of them have never really gotten over it. By every account, they liked the Faulkners, respected how hard the couple had worked, and were quietly horrified by what they were watching. A good guide knows the signs of altitude sickness better than they know their own face. The slowing gait, the repeated questions, the small fumbles, and they could see it coming for Adrian and Naomi long before the couple could feel it. So they did the only thing they were allowed to do. They offered the oxygen again and again. On the way up, in the camps, and on the climb, they offered and they urged, and at least one of them, by his own account afterward, came close to begging, holding out the mask in the dark and asking them, please, just for the night, just to sleep, just to think straight. But a guide cannot physically force a bottle onto a competent adult who has refused it in writing and out loud, who has signed the waivers and looked you in the eye and said no. To force it would be its own kind of assault, and the Faulkners had been completely clear. They said no every time, politely, warmly, certain, almost grateful for the concern. And the mountain kept taking its cut, quietly, the way it always does, while the guides carried bottles up a mountain for two people who would die rather than open them, and tried to make their peace with a refusal they were powerless to override. Imagine being that guide. You can see exactly what is coming, the cure is right there in your hand, but it's not in your contract not to use it on them. Honestly, I don't know what you would even do here. At the highest camp, the last stop before the summit, the warning signs were already there for anyone whose brain was working well enough to read them. Both had slept badly or not at all, which is normal up there, but both were also eating almost nothing and moving slowly around the tents in a way the guides noted with alarm. Naomi had developed a cough, the dry, persistent cough that is sometimes nothing and sometimes the first whisper of fluid gathering in the lungs. Adrian was repeating himself, asking the same questions a few minutes apart, a classic early sign that the altitude was starting to fog the mind. In a normal expedition, on bottled oxygen, climbers rest at that camp with a mask on, letting the oxygen do quiet repair work through the night, arriving at the summit push with something in reserve. Adrian and Naomi rested on nothing, their bodies burning down through the last of themselves in the thin air. And in the morning they got up and went higher anyway, because the entire point, the thing they had crossed the world and spent a fortune for, was to go higher on nothing at all. The guides watched them prepare to leave and understood there was nothing more they were permitted to do. On their summit night, they left the high camp in the dark, with the rest of the world breathing bottled bottled oxygen and the two of them breathing nothing but Everest. For a while they moved well, and you can imagine how that must have felt to them, how it must have confirmed everything they believed. The two of them rising through the dark air on their own lungs while the bottled climbers plodded past in their masks. This was the moment they had built their whole lives toward, the proof of the idea, and for a few hours it must have felt like they were right about everything. But the death zone always sends its bill, and it sends it late, after you have spent more than you can pay. Somewhere on the long climb up the summit ridge, Naomi began to slow in the particular way that terrifies experienced guides. Not tired slow, but wrong slow. Her movements clumsy, her footing uncertain, her words starting to thicken and wander. A clear-headed climber beside her would have seen it instantly for what it was and turned her around on the spot. But Adrian, himself climbing on a brain that was beginning to starve, did not see it because he no longer could. He encouraged her upward. He told her she was strong, that they were close, that they could do this. The altitude had already taken the part of him that might have recognized what was happening and quietly replaced it with a dull determination to keep going. There were two people going blind to their own deaths at the same time, each unable to save the other because neither could any longer see, roped together by a promise that no one left conscious enough to break. And this was the one thing nobody up there could fix for them. The call to turn around has to come from a clear mind, and by then I think both of their minds were already gone at this point. There was a last message, the way there so often is. From the high camp, the night before the summit push, Naomi had sent a short note out through the expedition's link, and it survives the way these things survive, made unbearable by what came after. She wrote that they were about to do the thing they had spent their whole lives preparing for, that the sky was clear and the mountain was waiting, and they had never felt more sure of anything. She wrote that whatever happened, they were doing it the right way, together, on their own terms, with nothing borrowed and nothing faked. She made a small joke about the bottled climbers around them and how loud the regulators hissed in the night. She said she loved everyone who had followed their journey, that this was the culmination of everything they believed, and that the next time they spoke, it would be from the top of the world with nothing between them and the sky. None of it reads as the words of a person in danger, and that is the most chilling thing about it, because by the time she wrote it, the decision that would kill them was already made and sealed. It was the last anyone ever heard from her. Naomi went first, near the top, her brain swollen past the point of return, and she stopped being able to climb or to descend or, mercifully near the end, to understand what was happening to her. She sat down in the snow, the way the dying often do up there, calm, almost peaceful, the cerebral edema smoothing away the fear, along with everything else. Adrian would not leave her, and could not have saved her even if he had tried, because by then his own mind was failing in exactly the same way, slow and certain, and the guides who reached them could do nothing but watch two people they had warned and urged and begged slip away inside the rule they had built for themselves. The guides tried. Of course they tried, at the end. Principle or no principle. But you cannot reverse advanced altitude sickness up near 29,000 feet with a couple already gone, and a rescue that high is barely possible for a healthy climber, let alone two who can no longer stand. The bottles that could have changed everything days earlier stayed sealed, because that had been the promise, and by the time anyone might have overridden it, there was no longer a mind present to give or refuse consent. Both of them died high on Mount Everest, within reach of the summit they had wanted so purely, killed by the one thing the mountain hands out for free to anyone who climbs it without oxygen, which is the slow, quiet shutting down of a brain with nothing left to breathe. They had done it their way. That was the whole horror of it. They had done it exactly, perfectly, fatally their way, and the mountain had let them the way it lets everyone who insists right up until it does not. Nobody could have reached them in time, and even if they had, there was no clear mind left to say yes to a rescue. That is what the promise actually cost, and I find it hard to sit with. Adrian and Naomi Faulkner never came down off Everest under their own power, and like so many who die that high, they could not be brought down at all at first, because recovery from the death zone is itself a deadly undertaking, and the living have to be protected before the dead. They stayed up there for a time, in the cold and the height, two more shapes on a mountain that holds far too many, near the route where other climbers would pass them in the seasons after, the way Everest forces the living to walk past its dead. The guides and Sherpas who had been with them came down, hollowed out, carrying the particular guilt of people who had done everything right and still watched it happen, who had offered the oxygen and been refused and were left to wonder forever whether one more plea, one different different word, one harder push might have cracked the certainty in time. Several of them gave up high altitude work for a while afterward. One reportedly never guided an oxygen-free client again and would not even discuss it. It is a weight that no amount of telling them it was not their fault will ever fully lift, because they were there and they saw it coming, and the cure was in the bag the entire time. 3 feet away, the whole long way up. In the months after, as the story spread through the climbing world, the thing people kept circling back to was the contradiction. Here were 2 people who had died for the idea of an unassisted, pure ascent, and yet their climb had been assisted in 100 ways they never seemed to count. Other people fixed their ropes. Other people broke their trail and built their ladders and carried their loads and cooked their food and read their weather and guided their steps and stood ready with the oxygen they would not take. The purity they died for had never actually existed. Not on a modern guided Everest. Not on the route they chose. Not for 1 hour of the climb. It was a story they told about themselves. A beautiful and seductive one. And the cruel truth is that the only part of the whole climb that was truly theirs alone, truly unassisted, truly pure in the way they had dreamed about, was the dying. Everything else had been a gift from other people. The mountain had given them the one completely unaided experience they ever really had on it, and that experience was death. They went looking for something pure on the highest mountain on earth, and the only pure thing up there was the thing that killed them. There is a terrible kind of irony in it that I have never quite been able to shake, the way a search for honesty ended in the most elaborate self-deception imaginable. 2 careful people walking into the one mistake their whole philosophy had been built to disguise. This is the one fact that I just cannot get over. The only thing they truly did without any help up there was die. Because every rope and ladder and step somebody else had made possible for them. Not tell this story to mock them, because there is nothing funny in it, and because the belief that killed them came from something real, a genuine love of the mountains and a genuine hunger to meet them honestly. That hunger has driven some of the greatest climbers who ever lived, and the world is richer for the handful of people who have stood on the highest places on earth with nothing in their lungs but the thin air around them. The difference is that the great ones who climb without oxygen are a tiny handful of the most gifted high-altitude athletes on the planet. People who have spent their whole lives learning exactly how far they can push before the dark closes in, who know their own bodies the way a surgeon knows an artery, and who turn around every single time the moment it starts to go wrong, because the summit was never worth more to them than the next morning. That last part is the part Adrian and Naomi never absorbed. They loved the idea of that life more than they understood the razor it is balanced on, and they mistook a refusal to ever turn back for strength, when on a mountain like that it is the most dangerous weakness there is. They thought the purity was the point. But the mountain does not reward purity, or punish it, or notice it at all. It simply takes whatever you cannot afford to give it. And the 2 of them had promised each other, in the name of love and principle, to give it the one thing they could never get back. They kept that promise. They kept it perfectly. And I wish, more than I can easily say, that just once, near the top, in the cold and the dark and the thinning air, one of them had been selfish enough, or frightened enough, or human enough to break it. If you liked today's video, go ahead and hit that like button, and also go ahead and subscribe. You know you want to. We'll see you next time.